Message collapsed. Classified Archive, Interstellar Conflict Documentation Project. Document Series, Terra 7 Witness Testimonies. Compiled by the Galactic Historical Preservation Council, Neutral Sector Archives. Access Level, Unrestricted, Post-Armistice Declassification Order 7741C. We thought we understood war. We had cataloged 612 species. We had watched civilizations burn and rebuild across 4 galactic arms. We thought we had seen everything war could produce. We had never seen humanity fight. We will not make that mistake again. Archon Commander Veltharis Dawn, Recurrent Dominion High Command. Post-surrender deposition, Standard Cycle 4890. Forward Archivist's Note. Filed by Senior Archivist Tessala M. Rin, Neutral Sector Documentation Corps. Date of compilation, Cycle 4894, 3rd quarter. Document classification at time of filing, Eyes Only, now DCLASSFID. What you are about to read is not propaganda. I want to be very clear about that from the beginning because I know what this looks like from the outside. It looks like the kind of document that winners produce to make themselves seem inevitable. It looks like mythology dressed up in the language of reportage. I understand the suspicion. I felt it myself when I was first assigned this project. But I was there. Not on the front lines. I am an archivist, not a soldier, and my body would not survive the gravitational stress of a warship in combat. But I was in the processing centers. I interviewed the survivors. I watched the footage that the Dominion's own sensor arrays captured, footage they never intended anyone outside their command structure to see. I read the internal communications of Dominion commanders as they tried and failed, and tried again to make sense of what they were encountering. This document is an attempt to preserve what actually happened during the 17 months, the period the humans call the War of First Contact, and which the rest of the galaxy is still trying to find adequate language for. The testimonies here come from multiple sources: human soldiers, human civilians, alien observers embedded with human forces, captured Dominion soldiers, Dominion commanders, and neutral sector traders who found themselves caught in the middle of something nobody had predicted. I have tried to let them speak for themselves as much as possible. I have not always succeeded in remaining objective. I will admit that now rather than pretend otherwise later. Some of what you are about to read will disturb you. Some of it disturbed me, and I have spent the last 3 years doing nothing but cataloging accounts of violence and its aftermath. But I think it needs to be read. I think it needs to be preserved exactly as it happened without softening or revision. Because the galaxy came very close, closer than most people currently understand, to a catastrophe that would have reshaped everything. And it was stopped by a species that everyone, including themselves, had written off as ordinary. T. M. Rin, Senior Archivist. Neutral Sector Documentation Corps, Station Halcyon. Part 1, The World Before the War. Testimony 1A. Witness, Commander Yusuf Aldenkamp, Earth Defense Coordination Force, EDCF, retired. Recorded, Cycle 4893, 1st quarter. Location of interview, Cape Town Recovery Center, Earth. You want to know what it was like before the war started? I'll tell you. But you have to understand, and I mean really understand, not just nod and move on, that when I say before the war, I'm talking about a world where we genuinely did not believe a war was coming. Not like people who see the storm clouds but convince themselves it's just weather. I mean we had no framework, no category in our heads for what was about to happen. We'd made contact with the Dominion about 11 years earlier. 11 years. That's not a long time, cosmically speaking, but for us it was everything. It reshuffled every conversation humanity was having with itself. Politics, religion, science, philosophy, everything had to be rebuilt around the new fact that we were not alone. And the Dominion initially seemed, I don't want to say friendly because that's not accurate. They were distant, bureaucratic. They treated contact with us the way you might treat contact with a newly discovered species of fairly interesting bird. Curious, documented carefully, not threatening. They sent envoys. We sent envoys back. There were meetings. There were agreements about communication protocols. There were lengthy, complicated negotiations about territorial boundaries in the local sector, borders that meant nothing to us because we had exactly one inhabited planet and a handful of outposts, but which apparently meant a great deal to the Dominion's administrative departments. We thought it was going well. God, we were naive. I was a logistics officer at the time, attached to the EDCF Coordination Center in Pretoria. My job, theoretically, was to manage the supply chains for Earth's small but earnestly maintained fleet of patrol vessels. We had about 42 ships at that point, proper ones, I mean, not the old chemical rocket-era things. We'd been reverse engineering Dominion propulsion technology for about 6 years, with their grudging permission, and we had vessels that could, in principle, reach our nearest Dominion-established waypoint in about 9 days. 42 ships. I want you to hold that number in your head for the rest of this account. The Dominion arrived at our outer sensor perimeter on a Thursday. I remember that because Thursday was our department's maintenance review day, and I was in a meeting about coolant polymer supplies for the secondary fleet when the alert came through. The alert that said we had 312 Dominion warships crossing into what we had understood to be human-designated space. 312. I remember looking at the number on the screen and thinking there had been some kind of data corruption, some miscount. I asked my deputy to verify it. She verified it. I asked her to verify it again. She gave me a look I still think about sometimes, this expression of very controlled calm over something that was very clearly not calm underneath, and she said, "Sir, the number is 312, and they are not responding to hails." I stood there for about 4 seconds, and then I started doing what logistics officers do. I started counting supplies. Testimony 1B. Witness, Trader Paveth Ool, Independent Sector Commerce Guild. Species, Threnali. Recorded, Cycle 4892, second quarter. Location of interview, Commerce Station Delavar, Neutral Sector. I have been trading in the outer corridors for 31 cycles now. I have seen border disputes. I have seen species claim territory they did not have. I have watched the Dominion absorb 4 separate civilizations in my working lifetime, and each time the pattern is the same. You move ships to the border, you make demands. The smaller civilization panics and either negotiates or resists for a short time before negotiating. The Dominion adjusts its borders, everyone adapts. That is how it works, that is how it has always worked. The Dominion is not cruel, they are efficient, they absorb. They integrate. The civilizations that resist and then surrender generally do well afterward, better than they did independently. There is a logic to it that I, as a trader who benefits from stable galactic infrastructure, have never had much reason to question. I was at Waypoint Station Kelveth when the fleet moved toward human space. I had a cargo hold of Dominion-manufactured processing units that I was scheduled to deliver to a human outpost at the edge of their system, a small scientific station, mostly young researchers, nobody important, just the kind of people who always seemed to be where humans were doing things. They liked to put their young researchers in cold places at the edges of things. I had noticed that about them. I watched the fleet go through on the main corridor's observation deck. It took nearly 2 hours for all the ships to pass. I counted the classes, strike cruisers, heavy carriers, siege platforms. This was not a diplomatic convoy. This was conquest. I canceled my delivery route immediately. Not out of any particular concern for the humans. I did not know them well enough to feel concern in a personal sense, but because war zones are bad for commerce and I had a ship to protect. A colleague of mine, another trader, a Veloci named Druth who had done business with humans for years, said to me as we watched the fleet pass, "They will be absorbed within 12 of their months. The humans don't have a real military." I agreed. I was wrong. We were all wronged. And what is remarkable, thinking back on it now, is not that we were wrong. It is the reason we were wrong. We were wrong because we did not understand what we were looking at when we looked at a human. We looked at them and we saw a small, soft creature with no claws and poor sensory organs, and a limited technological base, and we saw ordinary. We did not see what was underneath ordinary. I don't think anyone outside of humanity itself understood what was underneath ordinary. I'm not sure humanity understood it either. Testimony 1C. Witness, Dr. Amara Osaibansu, Xenodiplomacy Division, United Earth Council. Recorded, Cycle 4893, second quarter. Location of interview, Geneva Diplomatic Campus, Earth. I was the one who took the last call. There was a call before the fleet crossed the threshold. A formal communication from Dominion Sector Administration, routed through the standard diplomatic channels we'd established 11 years earlier. I was the senior xenodiplomacy officer on duty that evening. It was a Tuesday, local Geneva time, about 2 in the morning. I'd been sleeping in my office because we'd had intelligence suggesting something was being planned, though nobody could agree on what. The communication came in and I sat down at the console, still half asleep, and I answered it. The Dominion representative on the other end was a species I'd worked with before, a Lorathian, long-necked, with those flat, expressive eyes they have, very correct and formal in manner. His name was Envoy Third Class Marath. I had met him 3 times at formal functions, and found him professionally pleasant if not particularly warm. He read from a document. He read it in Dominion Standard, and then in Translated Galactic Common, and then waited while our translation systems rendered it into English for my benefit, though I understood Galactic Common well enough by then. The document was a formal notification. The recurrent Dominion was exercising administrative rights over what they called the Sol-adjacent unregulated sector, which included Earth and all human-established territories. We were being informed, not asked, informed, that a Dominion administrative fleet would be arriving to begin the integration process. We had the option to submit a formal objection, which would be reviewed within 90 administrative cycles, which at the time translated to roughly 2.5 years. The fleet the envoy added was already in transit. I remember sitting very still for a moment after he finished. Then I said, "Envoy Marath, I need to be very clear. Are you informing us that Dominion warships are already moving toward Earth?" He said, "Administrative vessels, yes." I said, "And you are doing this, all of this, because you believe we will simply accept it." There was a pause, not a long one, and he said something that I have thought about many times since. He said, "We do not expect resistance. Your species has no meaningful warfighting tradition compared to galactic standards. You have conflict among yourselves, yes, but you have never fought a war of species survival. You have never needed to. We believe you are, fundamentally, a peaceful people." I looked at him for a long time, and I thought, he is not entirely wrong, and he is so completely wrong that I don't even know where to start. I said, "Envoy, I am going to suggest, respectfully, that you review your historical assessments of our species before this fleet reaches our system." He nodded politely and disconnected. I sat alone in my office at 2 in the morning and stared at the blank screen and thought about the history of humanity. All of it, every century of it. Then I picked up my phone and called the Secretary General. I said, "They are coming." She said, "I know." I said, "They think we're peaceful." There was a pause, and then the Secretary General, a woman who had spent 40 years in the most difficult diplomatic theaters on Earth, said something I will never forget. She said, "Let them think that for as long as possible." Part 2, The First Contact War. Testimony 2A. Witness, Senior Fleet Commander Arasha Nkosi, Earth Defense Coordination Force. Recorded, Cycle 4893, 3rd Quarter. Location of interview, Johannesburg Military Archive, Earth. I commanded the forward defense line. 42 ships. I want to be honest with you about that number because a lot of the accounts you'll read have inflated what we had. We had 42 operational vessels. 12 of them were patrol class, essentially fast couriers with weapons bolted on. 18 were mid-class destroyers, decent ships, well-maintained, but a generation behind Dominion equivalents. 8 were what we called heavy cruisers, though by Dominion standards they were probably medium-weight at best. And 4 were carriers, more in name than in function, because we'd only just developed the fighter architecture that could make carriers useful in space-based combat. The Dominion fleet numbered 312 vessels. My staff ran the numbers for me when we had confirmed sensor data. Combat effectiveness ratios, force multiplication analysis, projected engagement timelines. I had a young analyst, a woman named Lieutenant Priya Chandrasekar, 26 years old, brilliant at numbers, who handed me a report that said, in formal military language but with very clear emotional subtext, that we could not win a direct engagement, that we should not attempt a direct engagement. That direct engagement would result in the complete destruction of Earth's defense fleet within approximately 4 hours. I read the report. I thanked Lieutenant Chandrasekar. I told her to start running adaptive scenario modeling instead. She looked at me, she said, "Commander, adaptive scenarios assume we have variables to adapt against this force." I said, "Run the models, Lieutenant, all of them. Don't filter out anything that looks impractical. I want everything." She ran the models. Here is what nobody outside the human defense establishment understood at the time, and what I think the Dominion fundamentally failed to grasp before it was too late. We had been preparing for this. Not specifically for the Dominion, not in a paranoid, warmongering way, but in the 11 years since first contact, every single human military institution on the planet had been doing the same quiet, steady, obsessive thing that humans tend to do when they identify a potential threat and are not sure of the timeline. They had been thinking. They had been thinking about naval doctrine, about asymmetric warfare, about the history of every technologically disadvantaged military force in human history that had ever managed to inflict meaningful damage on a superior enemy. They had been thinking about the lessons of guerrilla campaigns and ambush tactics and the specific physics of space combat and how the properties of void environments, no atmosphere, no friction, 360 degrees of potential approach vectors, changed the calculus of engagement in ways that pure force superiority could not completely dominate. They had been thinking and writing and running simulations and having arguments in rooms where the coffee was bad and the lights were too harsh, and people fell asleep at tables and woke up still thinking about the same problems. We did not have more ships. We did not have better technology. We had 11 years of very focused human ingenuity applied to a problem we had hoped we would never need to solve. When the Dominion fleet crossed our outer sensor threshold and ignored our first 3 hails, I gave the order to disperse. All 42 ships went in different directions. Testimony 2B. Witness, Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Wiersbicki, EDCF Destroyer Krakow, hull number 7. Recorded, cycle 4893, first quarter. Location of interview, Gdansk Veterans Medical Facility, Earth. I have a scar that runs from my left collarbone to just below my right ear. You can see it. I don't try to hide it. Reactor flare, first engagement off the Jovian waypoint. I was in the forward gunnery bay when the coolant seal failed. 4 of my crew died in the 9 seconds it took for the emergency suppression to kick in. I think about those 4 sometimes, when people ask me to describe the war as though it was something clean. It wasn't clean. None of it was. But I'll tell you what I remember about the first engagement, because you asked, and because I think it's important that somebody who was actually there says it plainly. We were assigned to the Jovian Intercept Corridor, the approach path between Jupiter's outer moons that any fleet coming in system from the ecliptic plane would need to navigate. Long approach, predictable geometry, gravity wells on multiple sides creating natural channel constraints. Our tactical planners had identified it as one of 6 priority intercept zones. 3 of our destroyers were assigned there, the Krakow, the Vistula, and the Dnieper. Our orders were not to win. I want to be clear about that. Nobody was ordering us to win against the force we were facing. Our orders were to engage, to gather sensor data on Dominion combat systems, to force their forward elements to maneuver and thereby reveal their formation logic, and to make them pay a cost, any cost, for passage through our zone. Then we were to run. I was 29 years old. I had joined the EDCF because the pay was decent and the training was extraordinary, and I had grown up in Gdansk watching the old naval ships in the harbor and thinking, I want to be on something that moves fast and matters. When the Dominion forward elements came through the Jovian corridor, I was at my station with my crew, and we were running a targeting drill. Not because command had ordered us to, we'd already had 3 drills that day, but because Ensign Kowalczyk had bet Specialist Dabrowski a week's rations that she could shave another half-second off their lock acquisition time. And when 2 people on a warship make a bet like that, you let them run it because that kind of competitive precision is exactly what you want in a gunnery crew. The sensor alarm went off mid-drill. I looked at the display. 54 Dominion vessels in our corridor. 54. Dabrowski said very quietly, "That is a lot of them." I said, "Yeah." He said, "We're doing the thing anyway, right?" I said, "We're doing the thing." He said, "Good." And he looked at Kowalczyk and said, "You owe me a week's rations when we come out the other side." She said, "I haven't lost yet." I gave the order to execute Protocol 7, which was what we called the engagement plan, and we went to work. Testimony 2C. Witness, Vice Admiral Commodore Rekhes Von, Recurrent Dominion Expeditionary Force. Species, Lorath. Recorded, Cycle 4892, third quarter under armistice conditions. Location of interview, Neutral Sector Station Kalathas Detention Processing Wing. I will tell you what I saw, you may record it. I have been told that cooperation with the archive process will be considered during my review proceedings, and I am choosing to believe that is true. I commanded the 7th Expeditionary Group, which constituted the right flank of the primary fleet, approximately 68 vessels, a mix of heavy cruisers and strike elements. We were assigned to approach the inner system via what the humans call the Jovian Corridor. Our pre-mission briefing had described the human defense force as minimal. 40 to 50 vessels, poor tactical training, limited combat experience. Our strategic assessment held that human military doctrine was essentially a copy of historical pre-contact Earth naval doctrine adapted for space, and therefore predictable. We expected a brief, uncomfortable engagement, followed by a request for ceasefire negotiations. The first thing that happened was that we could not find them. 42 vessels should have been easy to locate. We had the finest long-range sensor arrays in the sector. We had detection systems that could identify a vessel's hull signature at 3 million kilometers. We swept the corridor extensively before proceeding and found nothing. Nothing. My sensor commander told me that the human ships had dispersed. I acknowledged this. I told him to run a wider spectrum scan. He ran the wider spectrum scan, still nothing. We proceeded into the corridor. At approximately 11,000 kilometers from the IO waypoint, 3 things happened simultaneously. First, 3 human destroyers appeared on our sensor screens. They had been in the shadow of one of Jupiter's smaller moons, using its electromagnetic shadow to mask their signatures. A simple tactic, but one that should not have worked against our sensor arrays, and would not have, except that they had also deployed some kind of interference package that we had not anticipated. It created a false reading in our secondary scanning system, and caused our automated threat detection to weight the moon's natural signature over any anomalies in its shadow. Second, our forward 3 vessels began reporting targeting lock warnings from multiple angles simultaneously. Third, the human destroyers, 3 of them, against 54 of us, opened fire. Not in a pattern I recognized. Not in anything our tactical library had flagged as a human engagement style. The fire was precise. It was not aimed at our hulls. It was aimed at the junction points between our hull sections where structural stress was highest. It was aimed at our drive nacelle cooling systems. It was aimed, with an accuracy that I still do not fully understand, at the external relay nodes for our fleet communications array. In the first 90 seconds of engagement, we lost communications between 40% of my group's vessels. I want you to understand what that means. We could still see each other on visual. But the coordinated tactical communication that modern fleet engagement requires, the constant data exchange that keeps a fleet operating as a unit rather than as a collection of individual ships, was gone. In 40% of my group, in 90 seconds. My tactical officer looked at me. He said, "They know our communications architecture." I said, "That's not possible. Our communication systems are." He said, "They know it anyway." The 3 human destroyers accelerated toward us, not away, toward. My tactical officer said, "They're going to try to split our formation." I said, "They can't. We have 20 ships for every." And then I stopped, because they were not trying to split our formation. They were trying to make us consolidate it. They were pushing us toward a tighter grouping, because in a tighter grouping, our individual vessels couldn't maneuver independently without risking collision. They were turning our numbers against us. I gave the order to scatter. And that is when the other ships appeared. Not 3, not 30. We had not found them because they had been hiding in the debris field of the inner Jovian ring, small signature vessels pressed against rock and ice, running on minimum power. When they activated, they were already inside our formation. Inside it. I am an experienced commander. I have run military operations in 4 different theater systems. I know what a flanking maneuver looks like, what an encirclement looks like, what a calculated feint looks like. What happened in the Jovian corridor in the first hour of engagement did not look like anything I had ever seen. It looked like someone had taken every mistake my fleet could possibly make and arranged the engagement so that we would make all of them at once. Part 3, the 17 months. Testimony 3A. Witness, Dr. Amara Osaibansu, Xenodiplomacy Division, United Earth Council, continued. Recorded, cycle 4893, second quarter. People ask me what the 17 months were like from the diplomatic side, and I usually say something measured and professional about sustained pressure and negotiated attempts at ceasefire. That's the public answer. The real answer is that the 17 months were the longest period of sustained terror I have ever experienced, punctuated by moments of such extraordinary human capability that I sometimes had to remind myself to breathe. We were on a war footing from the first day. That meant the civilian government was technically still functioning, but making decisions in a military framework that none of us had trained for. I had a doctorate in xenodiplomacy and had spent 20 years of my life in the careful, quiet craft of building understanding between Earth and other civilizations. Now I was in a situation room at 3 in the morning listening to casualty reports and trying to figure out what we could say to the Dominion that might buy us another week. The Dominion was confused. That was the word I kept using in my reports, confused, and I used it carefully because it was accurate and because it implied something important. The Dominion was not losing, exactly not in the first months, but they were not winning in the way they had expected to win. The pace of their advance was much slower than their pre-mission projections. They were taking casualties they had not anticipated, and they kept doing something that I flagged repeatedly in my diplomatic analysis reports. They kept adjusting their assessment of us. I had access, through intelligence channels I won't detail here, to portions of Dominion internal communications during the war. What I saw in those communications was a pattern of continuous revision. First assessment, humans have minimal military capacity. Second assessment, humans have moderate military capacity, unexpectedly well organized. Third assessment, humans have developed novel tactical doctrines, recommend caution. Fourth assessment, recommend significant reinforcement of frontline elements. Fifth assessment, recommend strategic pause for doctrinal review. Sixth assessment, and this is the one I still think about, sixth assessment, which came about 4 months into the conflict. We may have significantly underestimated the human species' capacity for sustained conflict. Recommend High Command review of mission objectives. That assessment was filed by a Dominion sector admiral named Veltharis Dawn. I read it at the time and I thought, you have no idea. You have absolutely no idea what you've walked into. Because what the Dominion was seeing was not the full picture. What they were seeing was the forward edge, our organized military response, our fleet engagements, our tactical doctrines. What they were not yet seeing was the thing that has always been humanity's true force multiplier. The thing behind the military, the thing underneath all the strategy and the ships and the weapons. The human population. Testimony 3B. Witness, Civilian Coordinator Ngozi Ademi, Lagos Civil Defense Bureau. Recorded, cycle 4893, first quarter. Location of interview, Lagos Central, Earth. I was in charge of urban resilience planning for Lagos when the war started. That meant before the war, I was the person who worried about things like infrastructure failure during flooding events or supply chain disruption during a regional crisis. Practical, unglamorous work. I knew the city's power grid better than I knew most of my friends. When the first Dominion ground elements landed in the Niger Delta, about 3 months into the conflict, the fleet war was still happening in space, and most people thought the war would be decided before anything reached the ground. My office became something else entirely. In 24 hours, without instruction from any higher authority, without anyone sending down orders, without a coordinated national response having been formalized yet. My office staff, 12 people, none of them military, had converted our flood emergency protocols into something that functioned as a civilian resistance framework. We had contacted every civil defense unit in the metropolitan region. We had mapped every Dominion landing site against our infrastructure grid and identified the 8 critical supply nodes they were most likely to try to control. We had begun rerouting the power grid so that those nodes could be isolated and cut if needed, without affecting the residential sectors. And we had done something else. We had called the people, not the soldiers, not the government specifically, though I kept government informed. I mean, I had my staff on phones and radio and every comm system we could access, calling neighborhood council leaders and market association heads and informal community network contacts, and telling them, "Here is what is happening. Here is what they will try to do. Here is what we need from you." Lagos is not a city that waits to be told what to do. Lagos is a city that has, for its entire history, managed to function despite inadequate formal infrastructure by building human systems that fill the gaps. We had informal communication networks that had been running for decades. We had community solidarity structures that the war planner on the other side of the solar system had never heard of and would not have been able to map if they'd tried. Within 48 hours of the first ground landing in the Niger Delta, the Dominion ground elements found themselves in a city that looked, from their assessment data, like a city. And that functioned, in reality, like an organism that had decided, collectively, to make their presence as difficult as possible. Not through direct military confrontation, we were civilians with improvised tools, but through 1,000 small acts of sustained, organized, infuriating resistance that cost us almost nothing individually and cost them, cumulatively, everything. They couldn't find the power nodes because we had moved the visual markers and sent false reports through their signal intercepts. They couldn't move through the streets efficiently because the streets that had been mapped in their intelligence files were not the streets that were accessible, because Lagos maintains its own internal logic about which routes work on any given day, and we simply changed the logic. Their communication to their forward elements kept experiencing interference because the electromagnetic environment in a city of 23 million people doing whatever they needed to do with every piece of electronics they owned turned out to be a very effective form of passive jamming. A Dominion ground commander later described Lagos as environmentally hostile in ways that did not correspond to any known planetary defense system. I considered that a compliment. Testimony 3C. Witness, Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Wiersbicki, EDCF Destroyer Krakow, continued. Recorded, Cycle 4893, First Quarter. After the Jovian engagement, we pulled back and made our run. Those were the orders. Engage, gather data, make them pay, run. We ran. The Vistula didn't make it. I want to say that plainly because a lot of accounts of the early engagements focus on the tactical successes and allied what they cost. The Vistula took a direct hit from a Dominion heavy cruiser's primary weapons system at approximately 40,000 kilometers from the corridor exit point. The hit compromised her reactor containment. She had about 6 minutes. Her captain, a woman named Adiza Okonkwo, whom I had known for 4 years, who made terrible coffee and was the most methodical tactical thinker I have ever served near, used those 6 minutes to transmit her complete engagement sensor log to our command network. Everything her ship had observed and recorded. Every Dominion tactical response, every weapon's signature, every communication fragment their systems had captured. Then she ordered her crew to the escape pods. 41 out of 63 crew members made it to pods before the reactor went. Captain Okonkwo was not among the 41. I have been asked since whether I felt angry at that moment, whether I felt afraid, whether the loss of the Vistula changed how I thought about what we were doing. I felt all of those things. Of course I did. We were human beings in an impossible situation watching our comrades die. But here is what I remember most clearly from that moment. The Krakow received Captain Okonkwo's sensor log. Our tactical systems processed it in near real time. By the time we were clear of the Dominion pursuit elements, by the time we were in the relative safety of the outer system, Lieutenant Priya Chundreskar's team in the analysis center at EDCF Command had already used the data from the Vistula's last 6 minutes to identify 17 specific tactical response patterns in the Dominion fleet that they had not known about before. 17 vulnerabilities, not major ones. Small ones, seams in the armor. But that was how it worked. That was how we fought this war. Every engagement, no matter how costly, every sacrifice, no matter how devastating, everything became information, everything became data, everything became the raw material for the next adjustment, the next adaptation, the next innovation. The Dominion had more ships, they had bigger ships, they had better technology in most categories. But they had been fighting the same war for 600 years. Their doctrine was optimized, their formations were refined, their systems were elegant and efficient and fixed. We had been in space for 11 years, and we were terrified and furious, and we were changing every single week. Testimony 3D. Witness, Subcommander Yatha Vess, Recurrent Dominion Strike Group 14. Species, Vrethian. Recorded, Cycle 4892, 4th Quarter. Location of interview, Neutral Sector Witness Processing Station. My kind find it difficult to admit confusion. It is not in our nature. Vrethians are methodical by temperament, and we do not, as a general rule, find ourselves in situations we cannot categorize. The humans categorized us, constantly and repeatedly. They adjusted. We adjusted after the fact. They adjusted again before we had finished adjusting. I describe this sequence not to be flattering to them, but because I cannot describe what happened honestly without using that sequence. In my first engagement, I expected a disorganized resistance. The briefing had said disorganized. I had studied human military history, and it seemed to show a species that fought savagely but without unified doctrine, many armies, many strategies, many contradictory approaches. What I encountered was nothing like that. What I encountered was a single, apparently improvised response that seemed to anticipate exactly the approach I had planned. Not because they had intelligence, or perhaps they did, I cannot be certain, but because the humans I was fighting had specifically studied the kind of force I was leading. They had anticipated how a Vrethian commander would think. They had prepared for it. One of their officers, after the armistice, told me something that I have thought about at length. He said, "We spent 11 years reading everything the Dominion published. Every tactical paper, every doctrine document, we didn't have spies, we just read." I said, "We had the same access to your published materials." He said, "Yes, but did your high command do anything with them?" I did not answer, but the honest answer was no. Our high command had read the human materials and concluded that they were primitive and unimportant. The humans had read our materials and concluded that we were formidable, well-organized, and beatable in specific and identifiable ways. That is the difference. Part 4, the turn. Testimony 4A. Witness, Commander Yusuf Aldenkamp, EDCF, continued. Recorded, Cycle 4893, 1st Quarter. People talk about the Battle of the Asteroid Corridor as the turning point. They're not entirely wrong, but the turn started before the battle. It started in a supply warehouse outside of Nairobi, and it happened because of a problem we'd had since the beginning. Raw materials. We were losing ships faster than we could replace them. Not catastrophically, not at a rate that would destroy our capacity, but steadily. And our manufacturing infrastructure was not designed for wartime production. We had shipyards, yes. We had fabrication facilities, but converting a peacetime industrial capacity to war production takes time and expertise and logistics that we were scrambling to build on the fly. My job throughout all of this was supply chains. I was not a fleet commander. I was the person making sure that the fleet commanders had something to command. In the 3rd month of the war, I was in a converted warehouse outside Nairobi that we were using as a logistics coordination center. It was 2 in the morning local time. I was looking at a production gap. We needed 48 specific components for our destroyer-class engine cooling systems, and we were short by about 60% of what we needed. The standard manufacturing sources could not fill the gap in time. One of my junior officers, a young man named Marcus Achieng, who had come to us from a civilian engineering background, who had never worked in military logistics before the war, looked at the gap and said, "What if we don't use the standard components?" I said, "The standard components are spec. The engines need them." He said, "The engines need what the components do, not specifically what the components are." I looked at him. He pulled up a supply database. Not a military one, a commercial one, the kind of thing you'd use to source parts for industrial equipment, and started pulling items. filtration units from atmospheric processing plants, heat exchange materials from large-scale refrigeration systems, a series of pressure-rated couplings that were normally used in mining equipment. He said, none of these are the right component. All of them can be made to do the right thing. It took his team 6 days to reverse engineer a functional cooling system component from commercially available parts. It worked, not as elegantly as the original, not as efficiently. But it worked well enough to keep the ships running, and we could source the materials from 36 different commercial suppliers spread across the planet. Within 2 months, we had a parallel production system running, one using standard military manufacturing, one using adapted commercial materials, each feeding the other's gaps. It was ugly and complicated and required more maintenance than the clean spec system. But it meant we were building ships when the Dominion had expected us to run out of them. Marcus Achieng is now one of the most decorated logistics officers in Earth's history. He was 24 years old when he looked at a supply gap and decided the problem wasn't that we didn't have the right parts, but that we hadn't thought about the right parts correctly yet. That is, I have come to believe, a very human thing. Testimony 4B. Witness, Senior Fleet Commander Arasha Nkosi, EDCF, continued. Recorded, Cycle 4893, third quarter. The Battle of the Asteroid Corridor was a calculated risk. I want to be precise about that. I have seen it described in subsequent accounts as a moment of brilliance, a tactical masterstroke, the inevitable consequence of human ingenuity asserting itself. Those descriptions make it sound clean. They make it sound inevitable. It was not either of those things. It was a calculated risk, and the calculation was not certain, and there was a realistic possibility it would fail catastrophically. By month 7 of the war, we had learned a great deal about Dominion tactical doctrine. We had learned it the hard way, the way you learn things when your alternative is extinction, by paying very close attention, very fast, to everything that happened in every engagement and extracting every possible lesson before the next one. What we had learned most crucially was this: Dominion fleet coordination was excellent but inflexible. They had refined doctrine over 600 years of operations, and that doctrine was internally consistent and highly optimized, but it was optimized for a specific kind of opponent. An opponent who would fight in recognizable patterns, an opponent whose responses would fall within a knowable range. We were not that opponent. The Dominion could not adapt fast enough. Not because their commanders were unintelligent. Many of them, I came to understand, were extremely capable, but because their entire command structure was built around doctrine. When something happened outside the doctrine, it went up the chain for review, and review took time, and in combat, time is everything. We had built our command structure around opposite principles. Field commanders had enormous discretion. Junior officers were expected, actively encouraged, to deviate from plan if the situation demanded it. We had spent 7 months developing what my tactical team called the divergent response framework. Essentially, a doctrine of not having a doctrine, of being able to respond in genuinely unpredictable ways, because the response was genuinely being improvised by someone looking at the specific situation in front of them. The asteroid corridor plan came from a lieutenant. Not from Fleet Command. From a lieutenant named Esperanza Villanueva, who had been flying patrol routes in the inner system for 6 months and had spent her off hours studying the gravitational mapping of the asteroid belt. She came to my command center with a 17-page tactical document and a coffee that had gone cold. She was 27 years old, and she had the look of someone who had not slept in 2 days and was running entirely on conviction. She laid the document on my table and she said, "I think I know how to make them split their rear elements away from their main formation, and I think if we can do that, we can do something they won't see coming." I read the 17 pages. I called my senior tactical staff. We spent 4 hours taking the plan apart and then putting it back together. We found 11 problems with it. We solved 7 of them. The other 4 we decided to accept as risks because the overall logic was sound. Then I called Lieutenant Villanueva back in and I told her, "We're doing it." She said, "We're doing it." I said, "We're doing it. You're leading the forward element." She said, "I'm a patrol lieutenant." I said, "Not anymore." Testimony 4C. Witness, Lieutenant Esperanza Villanueva, EDCF Special Operations, promoted post-battle. Recorded, Cycle 4893, second quarter. Location of interview, Guadalajara Veterans Center, Earth. I still don't know exactly what made me think of it. I had been flying patrol routes for 6 months and thinking about the asteroid belt because it was the most interesting navigation challenge in the system, and because thinking about navigation problems kept my mind occupied during the long, quiet stretches. The belt isn't how people imagine it. It's not a dense field you thread your way through. It's vast and mostly empty. But in certain zones, particularly around the larger bodies, the gravitational interplay creates approach corridor constraints that are actually quite significant if you're flying something the size of a Dominion cruiser. I had mapped those constraints in my off hours because I find that kind of problem interesting, not because anyone asked me to. And one afternoon I was looking at my maps and I thought, the Dominion's rear supply corridor passes through here, and here, and here. And if something drove them toward that corridor, if they were pushed into a defensive consolidation that sent their rear elements toward the belt's inner edge, they would end up in a gravitational topology that their standard formation couldn't handle cleanly. I sat with that thought for about 3 weeks before I told anyone. Partly because I wasn't sure it was right. Partly because I was a patrol lieutenant and I didn't think it was my place. And partly because I'm an introvert and the idea of walking into Senior Fleet Commander Enkosi's command center with a 17-page tactical document written in my own time was one of the more terrifying prospects I had ever considered. But the war kept going, and people kept dying, and the 17 pages kept sitting in my personal files. So eventually, I picked them up and walked to the command center. The battle itself, I'll tell you what I remember, which is fragments, because that's what combat is. I remember the moment our decoy elements made contact with the Dominion forward screen. I remember my hands being entirely steady on the controls, and my mind being in a state of extraordinary calm that I have never been able to fully explain or reproduce. I remember the Dominion formation beginning to react, and the reaction being exactly what I had predicted, and feeling not triumphant but simply confirmed, the way you feel when an equation works out. I remember the moment we came through the asteroid zone inner edge, 17 of our most maneuverable vessels, the ones capable of the tightest navigation, and the Dominion rear elements realized what they were looking at. They were looking at ships that had come from a direction that was, by their navigational assessment, not navigable. They were looking at an attack vector that their tactical computer had flagged as impossible. The pause lasted about 4 seconds. In combat terms, 4 seconds is a very long time. I have been asked since whether I felt afraid during the battle. Genuinely afraid, the kind of afraid that makes you doubt yourself. I'll be honest, the fear came later. It came afterward when the shaking started and wouldn't stop for about 20 minutes. When my hands, which had been completely steady throughout, finally understood what they had been part of. During the battle itself, I was focused. Only focused. Not brave, not fearless. Just absolutely certain that I needed to do exactly what I was doing with every available piece of attention I had. I think that is what people don't understand about human combat capability. They see the outcomes, the victories, the innovations, the impossible maneuvers, and they attribute it to something extraordinary, some innate quality of the species. But from the inside, it doesn't feel like that. It feels like a person who is very scared being very focused because they cannot afford to be anything else. That's all it is. That's all any of it is. Part 5, The Breaking Point. Testimony 5A. Witness, Archon Commander Veltharis Dawn, Recurrent Dominion High Command Deposition. Species, Lorath. Recorded, Cycle 4891, fourth quarter. Location of interview, Neutral Sector Station Calatha's Formal Proceedings Chamber. I will not attempt to reframe what happened as something other than what it was. We were defeated. I have served the Recurrent Dominion for 41 years. I have conducted 3 successful integration campaigns. I have never previously filed a surrender deposition. The experience is not one I would recommend. What I want to convey, for the historical record, is that the defeat was not a consequence of miscalculation in the conventional military sense. We did not fail to bring sufficient force. We did not fail to anticipate specific tactical scenarios. We brought overwhelming force, and we had anticipated the scenarios that any rational analysis would have predicted. What we failed to anticipate was the rate of change. Humans change faster than any species in our catalogued experience. I do not mean technologically, though that is true as well. I mean strategically, doctrinally, conceptually. They assimilate information and translate it into adjusted behavior with a speed that we were not prepared for and could not match. By month 3 of the campaign, they were fighting differently than they had in month 1. By month 6, they were fighting differently than they had in month 3. By month 10, what they were doing bore almost no resemblance at the tactical level to what we had prepared for. Every time we adapted, they had already adapted to our adaptation. Every time we developed a countermeasure, it addressed a tactic they were already moving away from. We were perpetually arriving at a location they had already left. I have thought about this extensively. I have consulted with strategic theorists and cognitive specialists and historians of the Dominion's previous 600 years of operations. The conclusion I have reached is this. The Dominion's 600 years of operational experience was, in this specific conflict, a disadvantage. We were not capable of the kind of creative disorder that the humans employed. Our strength, our extraordinary efficiency, our refined doctrine, our optimized systems made us predictable. And predictable, against an opponent that had evolved specifically to fight unpredictably, was lethal. The Battle of the Asteroid Corridor was not the turning point. The Battle of the Asteroid Corridor was the visible symptom of something that had been developing for months. The turning point was the moment our strategic analysis team filed a report acknowledging that we could not model human tactical behavior with sufficient accuracy to plan effective countermeasures. You cannot fight a war against an enemy you cannot model. I ordered the strategic pause at month 11. I recommended ceasefire negotiations at month 13. The ceasefire was achieved at month 17. I have been asked whether I regret the campaign. The honest answer is that I regret underestimating the humans. I do not regret exactly the attempt to integrate them. That is the Dominion's function, and it has served the galaxy well for 6 centuries. But I failed to understand what they were before I moved against them. I looked at their technology and found it limited. I looked at their biology and found it unremarkable. I looked at their history and found it violent but provincial. I did not look at the thing underneath all of those things. The thing that explains why a species with 42 ships and 11 years of space travel held 17 months against the recurrent Dominion. I do not know precisely what to call that thing. I think the humans might call it stubbornness. I think the rest of the galaxy might call it something considerably less comfortable. Testimony 5B. Witness, Neutral Sector Trader Paveth Ul, continued. Recorded, Cycle 4892, second quarter. I came back to human space about 9 months after the war ended. I had a cargo hold, I had a delivery to make, and I will admit I was also curious. What I expected to find was a civilization beginning the long, difficult process of recovery. Some damage, some disruption, the kind of altered landscape you see after any conflict. I had seen civilizations after Dominion integration campaigns before. They looked, typically, somewhat dazed, and then they recovered and adjusted and went on. What I found in human space was not a civilization recovering. It was a civilization going faster. The war had done something to the production systems, the infrastructure, the social organization. Things that had taken years to plan and implement before the war were being done in months. Not because the war had simplified things, it hadn't, the war had complicated everything. But because the humans had spent 17 months learning to solve problems quickly, and they had not stopped doing that just because the shooting stopped. New ships, better ships. Ships that incorporated the adaptations and innovations developed during the conflict and went further. Manufacturing systems that the adaptive logistics model had made more flexible and efficient. Communication networks that the civilian resistance experience had made more robust and decentralized. And the humans themselves. I spent 3 weeks at Earth, delivering cargo and arranging return manifests, and I talked to people. Not in any formal capacity, I am a trader, not an archivist, but in the way traders talk to people, across tables in port facilities, waiting for cargo to clear, passing time. What struck me was not any single thing they said. It was the register, the way they discussed what had happened. They were not triumphant exactly. They were not arrogant. They had lost a great deal, ships, lives, communities disrupted, families broken, and they were not pretending otherwise. But there was something in how they held all of it. Something settled. Something, and I say this as a species observer with 30 years of cross-cultural experience, that I can only describe as a species that has looked at the worst version of what the universe can offer and found that it was survivable. Not comfortable, not easy, not without cost, but survivable. And having survived it, they were going to get up and do the next thing. I have traded with many species. I have observed many civilizations. I have only observed that quality in one. Part 6, Aftermath and Reckoning. Testimony 6A. Witness, Dr. Amara Osaibansu, Zeno Diplomacy Division, Final Entry. Recorded, Cycle 4893, Third Quarter. The ceasefire negotiations were some of the strangest weeks of my life. Not because they were hostile. By that point, the Dominion's posture had shifted so significantly that the conversations were almost collegial. Strange word to use for talks between a civilization that had tried to conquer us and the civilization that had spent 17 months making that very expensive. But collegial is accurate. What made them strange was the moment, about 3 weeks in, when Archon Commander Don, who was leading the Dominion side in person, which itself was significant, looked across the table at me and said, "I need to ask you something that is not part of the formal agenda." I said, "Go ahead." He said, "Did you know, before the war started, did your leadership know what your species was capable of?" I thought about it for a moment. The honest answer was complicated. I said, "We knew what our history contained. We knew what we had done to each other over the centuries. We knew that, backed into a corner with no alternative, we would fight." He said, "But did you believe you could win?" I thought about Arasha Nkosi and her command center with 42 ships. I thought about Marcus Achieng and his commercial components. I thought about Esperanza Villanueva and her 17 pages. I thought about Ngozi Ademi calling neighborhood council leaders at 2 in the morning. I thought about all the others, the thousands of others, who had done the next thing, and then the next thing, and then the next thing. I said, "No, we didn't know we could win. We knew we couldn't afford to lose." Those are different things. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that I think about often. He said, "In 600 years of operations, we have encountered many species that could not afford to lose. Almost all of them lost." I said, "I know." He said, "What is different about you?" I had no single answer. I still don't. I don't think there is one. I think it's many things, stacked on top of each other, interacting in ways we don't fully understand ourselves. The stubbornness, the adaptability, the specific quality of human creativity under pressure, which seems to work differently from how it works in peacetime, more focused, more urgent, more willing to discard the frameworks that aren't working and build new ones in real time. The way humans function as individuals, but coordinate as collectives in moments of crisis, not through top-down command, but through distributed, self-organizing systems that seem to emerge naturally when the need is sufficient. The sheer obstinate refusal to accept the terms of a situation you didn't choose. I said something vague and diplomatic to Archon Commander Don about resilience and the history of our species. But what I was thinking was simpler. I was thinking we grew up hard. All of us as a species, we grew up hard. We spent 10,000 years fighting each other and surviving disease and building civilizations in the wreckage of the last ones and failing and starting over and fighting each other again and surviving again. And something came out of all of that history. Something that doesn't look like anything from the outside. Something that looks like an ordinary, soft-bodied species on an unremarkable planet with limited technology. And it's not exactly. It's not ordinary at all. It took a war for the galaxy to understand that. I hope we don't need to demonstrate it again. Testimony 6B. Witness, Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Wiersbicki, EDCF, Final Entry. Recorded, Cycle 4893, First Quarter. After the armistice, I took leave for the first time in 17 months. I went back to Gdansk. My family was there, my mother, my younger sister, my sister's kids. I hadn't seen them during the war except on screen. The screens are not the same. My mother made the meal she makes when I come home. A thing she has made since I was a child, the same recipe her mother made and her grandmother before that. We sat at the kitchen table. My nephews kept trying to show me things on their tablets, and my sister kept telling them to give me space, and I told her it was fine. Let them show me. Outside the window, Gdansk looked exactly like it always had. The water, the old buildings, the bridge, the ordinary world. I sat there and I ate, and I listened to my nephews argue about something completely unimportant, and I thought about the Vistula, about Captain Okonkwo and the 6 minutes she had and what she chose to do with them. I thought about all the ways the war could have gone differently, the thousand small decisions that could have tilted the wrong way. The plans that worked because someone junior and brilliant had spoken up at the right moment. The materials that held together because a logistics officer had thought differently about the problem. The communications that stayed up because a city of 23 million people had, collectively, decided to make them stay up. None of it was inevitable. None of it was guaranteed. It happened because, over and over and over again, in conditions that were genuinely terrible, human beings looked at the situation in front of them and found one more thing they could do. I don't know if that's heroism. I'm not sure heroism is the right word. Heroism sounds clean, sounds certain, sounds like it was always going to happen that way. This wasn't like that. This was scared people being very stubborn. This was people who couldn't afford to quit, not quitting. I finished my mother's meal. I helped my nephews with whatever they needed help with. I sat on the couch and fell asleep watching something on the television and woke up at 3 in the morning with the apartment quiet and the water visible through the window in the moonlight. I sat there for a while, and then I got up, made myself some coffee, and started thinking about what came next. Because that's what you do. You always find out what comes next. Epilogue. Final Archivist's Note. Filed by Senior Archivist Tesala Emrin. Date, Cycle 4894, 3rd quarter. When I began this project, I thought my task was documentation. I thought I was assembling a record of a conflict, its causes, its conduct, its resolution. I thought I would end up with a clean historical file, events sequenced, testimony cataloged, lessons extracted for whatever future policy work might need them. That is not what I ended up with. What I ended up with, after 3 years of interviews and footage and communications intercepts, and midnight conversations in processing centers with people who were still shaking from what they'd survived, is something harder to classify. The humans are going to be a force in this galaxy. Not because they won the 17 months, any species, sufficiently cornered, can fight. Not because of their technology, which is improving fast but is not yet the most advanced. Not even because of their adaptability, which is extraordinary but not entirely unique. Because of the combination, the creativity and the stubbornness and the collective coordination and the refusal to accept the final terms of any situation, and all of it running simultaneously, interacting, amplifying each other. And because they are still accelerating. The galaxy looked at humanity for 11 years and saw an ordinary species. Bipedal, limited, confined to one star system, fighting each other as often as they cooperated. We were wronged. We were not wrong about the facts. We were wrong about what the facts meant. The ordinariness was not the whole picture. It was the surface of the picture. What was underneath, what the war revealed in 17 months of sustained combat against the most powerful military force in this sector of the galaxy, was something we had no framework for. Archon Commander Don was right to use the word terrifying. I would not have used it before I began this project. I would have thought it was melodrama. I would have been wrong. Not because humans are violent, not because they are dangerous in the way that a predator species is dangerous, but because they are exactly what they appear to be: limited, imperfect, frequently confused, often frightened, running on improvised solutions and insufficient sleep, and the stubbornness of creatures who cannot psychologically accept the alternative, and that is exactly enough. More than enough, as it turned out. That combination, in the face of genuine existential pressure. I don't know what word fits. Extraordinary doesn't quite cover it. Maybe there isn't a word in galactic common. Maybe the humans' own languages have something closer.